For 5 years, Richard dedicated himself to cultivating flowers, leaving behind a past that few knew about. But when criminals tried to extort the local shopkeepers, he realized that some roots never die. Now, the former agent would have to choose between his new life or the one he tried to forget. Neighborhood, the small flower shop Petals and Dreams was more than just a business. It was the refuge of Richard Mendez, a 45-year-old man who found peace among orchids and roses. His brown eyes, though gentle with customers, carried the weight of memories he preferred to keep buried, like seeds that should never sprout. The shop, with its pastel-colored walls and shelves filled with colorful pots, had become his sanctuary over the past 5 years. There, among the scent of flowers and the soft murmur of the decorative fountain, Richard had built a new life, far from the turbulent past that haunted him in occasional nightmares. That autumn morning, as he arranged a delicate bouquet of white lilies, Richard watched the street activity through the shop window. The doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Amelia, his oldest and most loyal customer. "Good morning, Mr. Richard. I came for inspiration for my granddaughter's wedding," said the elderly lady, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses. "You know how brides are these days. They want everything perfect." Richard smiled, momentarily setting aside his worries. "Mrs. Amelia, don't worry. I'll prepare something special. I have some peonies that just arrived. They're perfect for bridal bouquets." As they discussed arrangements and colors, a group of motorcyclists parked across the street. Richard noticed them through the reflection in the decorative mirror, his body instinctively tensing. There were 5 men, led by Mark Andrews, a local troublemaker who had recently started offering protection to the neighborhood shopkeepers. "Mr. Richard, are you listening?" Mrs. Amelia's voice brought him back to reality. "Sorry, Mrs. Amelia. You were saying about the wedding colors." But before he could continue, the doorbell chimed again. Mark and 2 of his companions entered the shop, their leather jackets creaking as they moved among the delicate floral arrangements. "Nice shop you have here, Mr. Richard," said Mark, running his finger over the petal of a red rose. "It'd be a shame if something happened to it, wouldn't it?" Mrs. Amelia, sensing the tension, clutched her purse tightly. Richard, with a calm that surprised even himself, gently guided her to the door. "We'll continue our conversation about the wedding later, Mrs. Amelia. Have a good day." After the elderly lady left, Richard turned his attention to the unwelcome visitors. His face remained serene, but his eyes had changed. They were now calculating, observant, reminiscent of a time he had tried to leave behind. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice controlled and professional. Mark approached the counter, a presumptuous smile on his lips. "It's simple, Mr. Richard. The neighborhood's been dangerous lately. We're offering a protection service for the shopkeepers. Just a small monthly fee, you know." Richard kept his gaze fixed on Mark, years of behavioral analysis training resurfacing. He noticed how the young man moved, how his companions positioned themselves strategically around the shop, the small tensions in their movements that revealed their inexperience in intimidation. "I appreciate the offer, but it won't be necessary," Richard replied, his voice calm but firm. "The neighborhood security is adequate, and I have a great alarm system installed." Mark let out a forced laugh, leaning closer to the counter. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Richard. It's not really an offer, it's more like an obligation for your own good, you know." At that moment, something shifted in the air of the flower shop. A subtle change, almost imperceptible to untrained eyes, but it made the 3 visitors fidget, suddenly uncomfortable. Richard had changed his posture, and though his face remained serene, an aura of authority emanated from him that hadn't been there seconds before. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice now carrying a tone that brooked no argument, "I appreciate the offer again, but my answer remains no. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have arrangements to prepare." Mark, trying to maintain his authoritative pose, deliberately knocked over a pot of orchids. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through the shop, but Richard didn't flinch. His eyes, however, registered every detail of the scene, the position of the shards, the pattern of the spilled water, the body language of each person present. "Oops, that was an accident," said Mark with a malicious smile. "Accidents happen, don't they? And they can happen more often if you're not cooperative. Richard calmly bent down, starting to pick up the shards of the broken pot. "You're right," he said, his voice taking on a different tone, almost nostalgic. "Accidents happen, and sometimes they remind us of things we'd rather forget." Something in the way he said those words made Mark hesitate. For a brief moment, the young man glimpsed something in the florist's eyes that made him involuntarily step back. "Think about my offer," said Mark, trying to regain control of the situation. "We'll be back tomorrow for a final answer." After the motorcyclists left, Richard remained crouched, still picking up the shards of the broken pot. His hands, calloused from years of working with flowers, moved with a precision that revealed years of training in another kind of work. In his mind, long-suppressed memories began to awaken. 20 years earlier, he wasn't known as Richard the Florist. His name was different, his life was different, and his skills served a very different purpose. As a special agent for an elite government intelligence unit, he had been trained to protect, to neutralize threats, to resolve complex situations without leaving a trace. But those days were behind him. Or so he thought until that moment. Standing up, Richard glanced at the old clock on the shop wall. It was almost 5 in the afternoon, time to visit his sister, Helen, as he did every Wednesday. As he closed the shop, he couldn't shake the thought that his carefully constructed life was about to change. The past, like a dormant seed, was beginning to awaken, and he knew he would have to make difficult decisions in the coming days. What Mark and his companions didn't know was that they had just awakened much more than a simple florist. Soon they would discover that some people can't be threatened without consequences, and that sometimes, behind the most peaceful facade, lies a much more complex story than one might imagine. The drive to Helen's house was short, but that afternoon it felt longer than usual. Richard drove his 1978 sky blue Volkswagen Beetle, a gift from his sister when he opened the flower shop. The car, like his new life, was a deliberate choice, discreet, reliable, and above all, ordinary. Nothing that would draw attention to his past. Helen lived in a yellow house with a small front garden where climbing roses embraced the white gate. Richard smiled as he saw that she had followed his gardening tips. The flowers were more vibrant than ever. His sister was a literature teacher at the local high school, loved by her students and respected by her colleagues. She represented everything he fought to protect, a normal, peaceful, and meaningful life. "Little brother," Helen greeted him with her usual tight hug. At 42, she maintained the same contagious energy from her teenage years. "I was just preparing that orange cake you love." Richard entered the familiar house smelling the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baking cake. In the living room, framed photos told the story of recent years. Helen at her graduation, Richard at the flower shop's opening, the two of them together at various Christmases and birthdays, a carefully documented life, proving they existed, that they were real, something that hadn't always been possible in the past. "How are things at school?" Richard asked, sitting at the kitchen table as he watched his sister take the cake. "Out of the oven. Ah, the teenagers keep me young," she laughed, setting the cake to cool. "But there's something different about you today, Rich. Your eyes look like they used to. Did something happen?" Richard hesitated. Helen was the only person who knew about his past, the only one who knew why he had disappeared for so many years before returning to open the flower shop. She was also the only one who could see through his carefully crafted facade of tranquility. "We had some interesting visitors at the shop today," he began, choosing his words carefully. "A group of guys offering protection." Helen stopped, cutting the cake, her hands trembling slightly. "Richard, please tell me you're not going to—" "Don't worry," he interrupted gently. "I'm not that person anymore. But I also can't pretend I don't know how to handle situations like this. That's why you chose flowers, isn't it?" Helen sat across from him, her eyes filled with concern. "Because they represent life, growth, renewal. You promised. Those days were behind you." Richard reached across the table, holding his sister's hand. "And they are. But some skills never completely leave us. I can use what I learned in a different way now." The sound of motorcycles passing by made both siblings turn to the window. 3 bikes slowly circled the house, their riders clearly observing the place. Helen tightened her grip on Richard's hand. "They followed you here," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "No," Richard replied, his voice calm but his eyes alert. "They already knew where you lived. They did their research like I would have in the past. That's why we need to be smarter than them." That night, after the motorcycles finally left, the siblings talked for hours. Helen shared some strange occurrences. Over the past few days, unknown cars parked near the school, people asking about her routine, a sudden interest from new students in her classes. "Tomorrow, you'll stay at Clara's house," Richard decided, referring to Helen's best friend, who lived in another neighborhood. "Tell the school there's a family emergency." "I can't just abandon my students," Helen protested, "and you know running away isn't the solution." Richard smiled, a smile that mixed sadness and determination. "We're not running, we're being strategic. Remember what Dad always said? In a game of chess, sometimes you need to move a piece back to protect the king." The mention of their father brought tears to Helen's eyes. Alberto Mendez had been an extraordinary man, a diplomat, who served the country in delicate missions, always prioritizing negotiation over conflict. He was the one who inspired Richard to pursue a career in intelligence, and also the one who taught him that true strength lies in knowing when not to use force. "What are you going to do?" Helen asked as she helped her brother wash the coffee. "Dishes." "I'll do what Dad taught me," Richard replied, putting the cups away. "I'll negotiate, observe, understand. There's always more at play than meets the eye. These guys, for example, they're not what they seem." "How so?" "Their bikes are too new for a local group. Their gear is expensive, but their intimidation techniques are amateurish. There's someone bigger behind them, someone testing the neighborhood shopkeepers for a reason." Helen recognized that tone of voice. It was the same one Richard used years ago when unraveling a particularly complex case. "You're already investigating, aren't you?" "Let's just say some old observation skills are still useful," he smiled. "And working in a flower shop gives you a perfect cover to watch the neighborhood without raising suspicions." The sky was already dark when Richard said goodbye to his sister. Before leaving, he checked all the locks in the house, discreetly installed some motion sensors he always carried with him, another habit he never completely abandoned, and programmed emergency numbers into Helen's phone. "Remember, anything so suspicious, you call Clara immediately and go to her house. No questions, no hesitation," he instructed, hugging his sister tightly. "You take care too," Helen replied, her voice choked. "I don't want to lose you to that world again." Richard got into his Beetle, watching through the rearview mirror as Helen closed the door. The streets were quiet now, but he knew the calm was only superficial. Somewhere, Mark and his group were planning their next move, and Richard needed to be ready. As he drove back to his small house behind the flower shop, his mind worked through different scenarios and strategies. The Richard of 5 years ago would have handled the situation very differently. But the man he was now, the florist who found peace among roses and orchids, knew there were other ways to deal with threats. After all, as his beloved flowers had taught him, sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing how to bend in the wind without breaking. The next morning dawned with a light drizzle, typical of autumn. Richard opened the flower shop earlier than usual, using the quiet of the early hours to reorganize his thoughts and plan his next steps. As he sprayed water on the orchids, his mind catalogued every detail of the past 24 hours. The doorbell chimed precisely at 7:30. It was Mr. Joseph, the baker from the corner, who always stopped by to drop off fresh bread before opening his own bakery. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," said the gray-haired man, placing the basket of bread on the counter. "You won't believe what happened last night at the bakery." Richard listened attentively as Mr. Joseph recounted how the same motorcyclists had visited his shop. However, something in the story caught his attention. They specifically asked about the backlots. Yes, Mr. Joseph confirmed, adjusting his glasses. They wanted to know if I had documentation for the entire area, including that abandoned piece behind the shops. I thought it was strange, you know. What kind of protection service is interested in deeds? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in Richard's mind. After the baker left, he grabbed his notebook, a simple model he kept in. the office drawer. Years of investigative work had taught him that information was the best weapon anyone could have. He accessed the City Hall's portal and began researching the neighborhood's properties. What he found made his eyebrows rise in surprise. There was an urban revitalization project underway, and the entire commercial area of the neighborhood was included in the plan. "Excuse me," a feminine voice interrupted his research. "Is it too late to order an arrangement for this afternoon?" Richard looked up and saw an elegant woman in her 50s wearing a well-tailored suit. Something about her posture was familiar. "Of course, ma'am. Beatrice Andrews," she completed, handing him a business card. "I'm the project coordinator for Horizon Construction." The surname didn't go unnoticed. Andrews, the same surname as Mark, the leader of the motorcyclists. Richard accepted the card, keeping his expression neutral as his brain processed the information. "How can I help you?" "I need a special arrangement for the inauguration of a new development," she explained, her eyes scanning the shop with interest. "Something that conveys renewal, change, progress." As they discussed flowers and colors, Richard observed every movement Beatrice made. Her body language indicated she was comfortable with authority, accustomed to being in charge. Occasionally, her eyes lingered on specific points in the shop: the walls, the ceiling, the structure. "You know, Mr. Richard," she commented casually, as he prepared a sketch of the arrangement, "this neighborhood has a lot of potential. It's a shame some properties are so underutilized." "Indeed," he replied, keeping his tone casual, "but I believe every business here has its value to the community." Beatrice smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Certainly, but sometimes progress requires adaptations. Have you ever thought about expanding your business, or perhaps relocating it?" At that moment, Richard was certain Beatrice Andrews wasn't there just for a flower arrangement. The visit was an assessment, a probe, and Mark, likely her son or nephew, was being used as an instrument of pressure. "I appreciate this location," Richard replied, finalizing the sketch. "I've built a loyal clientele here." "I see," she said, her voice taking on a firmer tone. "But sometimes, Mr. Richard, it's wiser to accept inevitable changes. Difficulties may arise for those who resist progress." The veiled threat hung in the air like the scent of jasmine, subtle but undeniably present. Richard maintained his professional smile as he finalized the order. After Beatrice left, he immediately called some old contacts he still had at City Hall. The information he obtained confirmed his suspicions. Horizon Construction had recently acquired several properties in the area, and there were rumors of a major commercial project in development. During lunch, Richard decided to visit some neighboring shopkeepers. At the pharmacy, Mrs. Martha revealed that she had also received visits from the motorcyclists. At the grocery store, Mr. Pedro confided that he was considering selling his shop after strange accidents started happening. Back at the flower shop, Richard found a brown envelope on the counter. Inside were photos of Helen leaving school, entering the supermarket, chatting with friends at the cafe. The message was clear. They knew how to hit him, but two could play that game. Richard activated his old laptop, the one he kept in the false bottom of a drawer. Within minutes, he was scouring public records, corporate contracts, and construction company documents. What he found made him smile for the first time that day. Horizon Construction had an interesting history of questionable business practices. Several of their projects had been halted due to irregularities, and there were complaints of dubious practices in their negotiations with property owners. But the most interesting was a series of leaked emails suggesting a scheme of overbilling in public contracts. Richard knew that information was power, but he also knew he needed to use it wisely. He didn't want to destroy anyone. His days of aggressive operations were in the past. His goal was to protect his sister, his business, and his community. As he watered the last plants of the day, a plan began to form in his mind. Beatrice Andrews and her group wanted to play hardball, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Richard wouldn't be just a cornered florist. He would be the strategist he once was, using intelligence and information instead of force. The doorbell chimed again. Mark and his companions had returned as promised for their final answer. Richard greeted them with a serene smile, the same smile he used when negotiating in his old missions. "Gentlemen," he said, "how about we talk business? I have some interesting proposals to share with Mrs. Andrews." The confused expression on Mark's face confirmed what Richard already suspected. The young man didn't know that he was aware of his connection to Beatrice. It was time to show that some flowers, though delicate, have sharp thorns when necessary. The meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning at the law office of Dr. Fernando Meireles, an old acquaintance of Richard from his government days. The lawyer, known for his unwavering integrity, had agreed to help as soon as Richard explained the situation. "So this is what we've uncovered," said Richard, spreading documents across the mahogany table. "Horizon Construction is using intimidation to devalue the neighborhood properties. Then they offer to buy the businesses at prices well below market value." Dr. Mireles adjusted his tortoise-shell glasses, examining the papers with meticulous attention. "Interesting, especially these emails about previous bids, but we need more concrete evidence of the current threats." "That's where the second part of the plan comes in," Richard replied, pulling out his tablet. "I've installed security cameras in the flower shop and in some of the shops whose owners agreed to collaborate. Everything's perfectly legal and with signed authorization." On the screen, clear images showed the intimidating visits from the motorcyclists. The crisp audio captured every veiled threat, every suggestion of accidents that could happen. "Excellent investigative work," praised the lawyer. "I see your skills haven't rusted, but why didn't you take this directly to the police?" Richard smiled, a smile that mixed wisdom and caution. "Because I don't want to destroy anyone, Fernando. I want a solution that benefits everyone. The neighborhood really needs revitalization, but not like this." That same afternoon, Richard organized a secret meeting in the parish hall of the local church. One by one, the neighborhood shopkeepers arrived discreetly. Mr. Joseph from the bakery, Mrs. Martha from the pharmacy, Mr. Pedro from the grocery store, and several others. All had similar stories to share. "What we need," Richard explained, after everyone had shared their experiences, "is to show that we're stronger together. Horizon Construction wants to divide us, make us feel isolated and vulnerable, but together we can negotiate on fair terms." "But how?" asked Mrs. Martha, her voice trembling slightly. "They have money, lawyers, connection, and we have something even more valuable," Richard replied, his voice calm but firm. "We have the truth on our side, proof of their irregularities, and, most importantly, we have the community." The plan Richard presented was complex but elegant. Each shopkeeper would contribute with their own skills and resources. Mr. Joseph, who knew everyone, would be responsible for mobilizing the residents' support. Mrs. Martha, with her contacts in the business association, would articulate institutional support. Mr. Pedro, who had a journalist nephew, would ensure the story, reach the media at the right time. "But the most important thing," Richard continued, "is that we'll do everything within the law. No violence, no threats, no playing their game. We'll show there's a better way." As the meeting progressed, Helen arrived discreetly, bringing Clara, her best friend, who worked as an urban architect. The two had prepared an alternative presentation for the neighborhood's revitalization. "Look," Clara explained, projecting images on the wall, "we can transform this area into a cultural and commercial hub that preserves the local identity. Small businesses, green areas, cultural spaces, all integrated and sustainable." The shopkeeper's eyes lit up as Clara explained the project's details. It was a different vision from the standardized shopping center Horizon Construction was planning. "But how will we finance this?" someone asked. "I've already thought of that," Richard replied. "I have contacts in some credit unions that support community projects, and with Horizon Construction's questionable history, we can push for a fair negotiation." At that moment, Richard's phone vibrated. It was a message from an old intelligence colleague. Information confirmed. Beatrice Andrews has a meeting scheduled with Chinese investors next week. They're counting on acquiring the neighborhood properties to close the deal. Richard smiled. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. The construction company's haste in pressuring the shopkeepers now made complete sense. "Tomorrow," he announced, to the group, "we'll take the first step. Each of you will receive a legal notice prepared by Dr. Mireles documenting the threats and intimidation. Simultaneously, we'll send the construction company our counter-proposal, a joint revitalization project with community participation. And if they refuse? Asked Mr. Joseph, worried. Then, Richard replied, his gaze determined, we activate Plan B. I have enough evidence of irregularities in their operations to ensure they'll prefer to negotiate rather than face a full investigation. When the meeting ended, it was already night. Helen stayed behind, helping her brother organize the documents. You're different, she observed. More alive, more yourself. Richard stopped what he was doing, reflecting on his sister's words. You know, Helen, I spent so much time trying to bury my past that I forgot some skills can be used for good. I don't need to be the hardline agent I was before, but I also don't need to be just the quiet florist. So you've always been both. Helen smiled, hugging her brother. The brilliant strategist and the man who finds beauty in the little things. That's why I know you'll resolve this situation. As they closed the parish hall, Richard looked at the neighborhood lights. In every lit window there was a family, a story, a dream. That was why he was fighting. Not just for his flower shop or his sister, but for an entire community. The next day, when Mark and his companions appeared at the flower shop, they would find a different man. Not an easy target, not a violent threat, but someone who knew exactly how to play this game and win without spilling a drop of blood. The morning arrived with a soft mist covering Flower Village. Richard opened the flower shop promptly at 7, as he always did. On the main counter, a special arrangement of lilies and orchids awaited, an order Beatrice Andrews was supposed to pick up personally that morning. The doorbell chimed at 9, sharp. Mark entered first, followed by Beatrice Andrews, who today wore an elegant grey suit. The expression on the young biker's face was one of anticipated triumph, clearly expecting to find an intimidated and submissive florist. Good morning. Richard greeted them cordially, pointing to the arrangement on the counter. Your order is ready, Mrs. Andrews. I hope you appreciate the color combination I chose. Each flower has its own meaning. Beatrice approached the arrangement, studying it with critical eyes. Interesting choice. White lilies represent purity, don't they? And also truth, Richard added softly. The orchids, on the other hand, symbolize refinement and power. I thought it appropriate for the occasion. Before Beatrice could respond, the flower shop door opened again. Dr. Fernando Mireles entered, followed by Clara, the architect, and 3 other men in well-tailored suits. Mrs. Andrews, Richard continued, maintaining his professional tone, allow me to introduce some people who are interested in discussing the future of our neighborhood. Beatrice's face hardened slightly, while Mark took a step forward, his posture threatening. Richard raised a hand in a pacifying gesture. Please, there's no need for hostility. I'm sure everyone here prefers a civilized business conversation. Dr. Mireles stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the counter. Mrs. Andrews, I'm Fernando Mireles, legal representative of the newly formed Flower Village Shopkeepers Association. We have a proposal we believe will be of interest to you. Clara began unrolling blueprints and architectural plans on a side table, while the other men, representatives of credit unions and local investors, positioned themselves strategically around the shop. What exactly is this about? Beatrice asked, her voice controlled, but with an underlying note of tension. Richard gestured toward the plans, an alternative that benefits everyone involved. Instead of a hostile acquisition process, we propose a partnership for sustainable neighborhood revitalization. Clara began her presentation, showing images of a project that blended modernity with the preservation of local identity. Tree-lined, plazas, commercial boulevards, cultural areas, all integrated with the existing businesses. As you can see, Clara explained, the return on investment is comparable to the planned shopping center, but with significantly greater social benefits and reduced risk of community resistance. Beatrice studied the numbers with interest, while Mark looked increasingly uncomfortable. Richard observed the scene with the calm of someone who had already predicted all possible moves. Impressive, Beatrice finally commented. But what makes you think Horizon Construction would be interested in modifying our already approved plans? It was then that Dr. Mirels opened his briefcase, pulling out a series of carefully organized documents. Mrs. Andrews, we also have here a detailed dossier on certain irregularities in Horizon Construction's previous projects. I'm sure you'd prefer to avoid any negative publicity, especially with the Chinese investors arriving next week. Beatrice's sudden pallor confirmed that the shot had hit its mark. Mark took a threatening step toward the lawyer, but Richard intervened smoothly. "Mark," he said, his voice calm but firm, "there are security cameras throughout the shop. Besides, several people know about this meeting. Violence would only make things worse for everyone." Beatrice raised a hand, stopping her young enforcer. Her eyes met Richard's, and for the first time there was a glimmer of respect in them. "You're not just a simple florist, are you?" Richard smiled, starting to water some nearby plants. "Mrs. Andrews, we're all more than we seem at first glance. You, for example, are more than a ruthless businesswoman. You're someone who built an empire from scratch, who understands the value of hard work and perseverance." He paused, turning to face her directly. "That's why I believe you'll recognize that this proposal is the best outcome for everyone. Your company maintains its profit and gains prestige for an innovative urban revitalization project. The community preserves its identity and thrives. Everyone wins." A tense silence filled the flower shop. The scent of flowers hung in the air as Beatrice considered her options. Finally, she turned to the credit union representatives. "How much time do we have to discuss the financing details?" The next 2 hours were dedicated to intense negotiations. Numbers were discussed, plans were modified, and compromises were established. Mark remained in a corner, clearly out of place now that the situation had shifted from intimidation to professional negotiation. When the meeting finally ended, Beatrice turned to Richard one last time. "You know, in other times, I would have crushed any resistance without a second thought. But you changed the rules of the game." "Sometimes," Richard replied, handing her the flower arrangement, "true strength lies in knowing when to change strategies. Flowers teach us that. They bend in the wind but don't break." After everyone had left, Helen entered through the back door where she had been anxiously waiting for the outcome. "Did it work?" she asked, hugging her brother. Richard smiled, looking out the window where he could see Mark and his companions, leaving on their bikes this time without their threatening posture. "It worked, Helen, and the best part is that no one got hurt. Dad would be proud. We resolved everything with intelligence and diplomacy." "Like the old days," she joked, "only now you use flowers instead of, well, you know." Richard laughed, returning to care for his plants. The afternoon sun streamed through the flower shop windows, making the petals shine like colorful jewels. Somewhere in the city, Beatrice Andrews was probably already reorganizing her plans, adapting to the new reality he had created. But there, among his flowers and his sister's smile, Richard knew he had found the perfect balance between his past and his present. Sometimes, the greatest victories are achieved not through confrontation, but through the ability to turn adversaries into allies. A week after the meeting at the flower shop, Flower Village buzzed with activity. Architects measured the streets, engineers assessed structures, and City Hall representatives circulated through the neighborhood with clipboards and tablets. The news of the Sustainable Revitalization Project had spread quickly, attracting local media attention and sparking interest from other city neighborhoods. Richard watched it all from inside his flower shop, which now served as an informal meeting point for the Shopkeepers Association. Between customers, he noticed the subtle changes already beginning to take place. Residents walked taller, with more pride. Shop facades were being renovated. Even the flowers in private gardens seemed more vibrant. "I can't believe you actually pulled this off," said Mr. Joseph, entering the shop with a basket of fresh bread. "Beatrice Andrews came to the bakery personally yesterday. She wanted to discuss integrating a gourmet cafe into the expansion project." Richard smiled, arranging a vase of chrysanthemums. "People can surprise us, Mr. Joseph. Sometimes they just need to see there's a better way." The doorbell chimed again. It was Mark alone this time, without his usual leather jacket. He looked younger and more vulnerable in a simple polo shirt. "Mr. Richard," he began, visibly uncomfortable, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Mr. Joseph gave Richard a concerned look before discreetly excusing himself. Richard gestured to a chair for Mark, maintaining a neutral but receptive expression. "My aunt, Mrs. Andrews, she told me about your past," Mark said hesitantly. "Not everything, but enough for me to understand that you could have handled the situation very differently." "And why do you think I didn't?" Richard asked, starting to prepare an arrangement as they talked. Mark was silent for a moment, watching Richard's skilled hands work with the flowers. "At first I thought it was fear, then I thought it was weakness. Now I don't know what to think." "Sometimes," Richard replied, carefully selecting a lily, "true strength lies in choosing not to use force. Your aunt understood that when we presented an alternative that benefited everyone." "That's what I wanted to talk about." Mark straightened in his chair. "I want to learn, not about flowers, but about negotiation, strategy. The way you handled all this, it was amazing." Richard stopped what he was doing, studying the young man before him. Where he once saw only an arrogant intimidator, he now saw something different, potential, perhaps even regret. "Why the sudden interest?" "My aunt offered me a position in the revitalization project," Mark explained. "She said if I want to be part of this, I need to learn how to do things the right way, and, well, after seeing how you handled everything, that's how I want to be." At that moment, Helen entered the shop carrying a folder full of documents. She paused upon seeing Mark, but Richard gave her a reassuring gesture. "Helen, you're just in time," Richard said. "Mark here is interested in learning about negotiation and community project management. I thought maybe you could include him in the educational committee meetings." Helen raised her eyebrows, surprised, but years of teaching experience had taught her to recognize a transformative moment when she saw one. "Of course," she replied, smiling. "In fact, we've been needing someone to coordinate the youth apprenticeship program we want to implement with the revitalization." Mark's face lit up with something Richard hadn't seen before: hope. It was the same look he himself had when, years ago, he decided to leave his old life behind and start anew. The afternoon progressed as the three discussed possibilities. Helen explained the educational programs they planned to implement in the neighborhood. Mark shared ideas about engaging other local youth, and Richard occasionally offered insights from his vast experience in managing complex situations. "You? No," Mark said as the conversation wound down. "The other guys in the group, they're also interested in being part of this. In a legitimate way, I mean." Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Helen. "Maybe it's time to expand the youth apprenticeship program, don't you think, sis?" After Mark left, Helen helped Richard water the plants at the end of the day. "Did you plan this too?" she asked, curious. "Not everything can be planned, Helen," he replied, smiling. "Sometimes, like with flowers, you just need to create the right conditions and let things grow naturally." Richard's phone vibrated. It was a message from Beatrice Andrews. The Chinese investors had loved the sustainable revitalization project. In fact, they were interested in replicating the model in other city neighborhoods. "Looks like your flowers are going to spread throughout the city," Helen joked, reading the message over her brother's shoulder. Richard looked out the window, where the sun was setting over Flower Village. At the end of the street, he could see Mark talking animatedly with some of his former companions, probably already sharing plans for the future. "You know what's most interesting about gardens, Helen?" he asked, adjusting a pot of orchids. "No matter how much you plan, there are always surprises. Flowers you didn't plant appear, carried by the wind. Plants that seemed weak turn out to be the most resilient. It's like life. Sometimes the biggest transformations start in the most unexpected places." The doorbell chimed once more. It was Clara, the architect, bringing the final project plans. "You won't believe what we discovered about the neighborhood's underground," she said excitedly. "There's an old tunnel system we can transform into an incredible underground cultural center." Richard smiled, realizing his adventure was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning in a completely new and unexpected way. The tunnels beneath Flower Village turned out to be much more extensive and intriguing than Clara initially imagined. With flashlights in hand, she, Richard, and a small team, of archaeologists explored the underground corridors, uncovering a fascinating history that had remained hidden for decades. "Incredible," Clara exclaimed, her eyes shining with enthusiasm as she examined the ancient brick walls. "These tunnels seem to have been built in the early 20th century. There are markings here suggesting they were used for storing goods from the old local commerce." Richard ran his hand along the damp walls, his training allowing him to notice details others might miss. "Look at these markings here." He pointed to some symbols carved into the bricks. "They seem to be records of dates and types of goods." Dr. Santos, the team's lead archaeologist, approached with his notebook. "Exactly. And from what we found in the municipal archives, this tunnel system connected several important points in the neighborhood back then. It was a true underground trade network." The discovery of the tunnels had added a new dimension to the revitalization project. Clara was already envisioning the possibilities. "We can turn this into something unique. A cultural center that tells the neighborhood's history, art galleries, themed cafes." "And the most interesting part," Richard added, "is that this strengthens our proposal to preserve local identity. These tunnels are part of the neighborhood's living history." As they explored further, they found a larger room that seemed to have been a meeting point. On the walls, old framed photographs showed Flower Village in its early days. The images, though faded, depicted bustling streets, merchants selling their wares and families gathered in the square. The room itself had a long wooden table at its center, surrounded by chairs that looked as though they had been untouched for decades. "Look at this." Helen, who had joined the exploration, pointed to one of the photos. "This shop, it's exactly where your flower shop is now, Richard." In the yellowed photograph, an old flower shop occupied the same space where Richard now cultivated his flowers. The name on the partially visible sign read, "Flowers and Memories." "Destiny, isn't it?" Helen smiled, hugging her brother. "It seems you were meant to continue a tradition without even knowing it." Mark, who was also part of the exploration team as the new coordinator of the youth apprenticeship program, approached with some old documents he had found on a dusty shelf. "Mister." "Richard, you need to see this," he said, carefully handing over the papers. "These are records of a merchant society that existed here in the early 20th century. They used to meet in these tunnels to plan the neighborhood's development." Richard examined the documents with growing interest. "A merchant's cooperative. Exactly like what we're doing now. History has a funny way of repeating itself." Beatrice Andrews, who had insisted on personally joining the exploration, seemed equally fascinated. "This changes everything," she declared, her professional. Their tone mixed with genuine excitement. "We can create a project that not only preserves this history, but turns it into a unique attraction for the city." The exploration continued for hours, each new corridor revealing more secrets of Flower Village's past. In one of the rooms, they found old gardening tools and detailed records about flower cultivation in the area. "Look at this," Helen said, flipping through an old notebook. "They used to grow rare orchid species down here, using the constant temperature of the tunnels as a natural greenhouse." Richard's eyes lit up with a new idea. "What if we revitalize that too? An underground garden, using modern techniques, alongside traditional knowledge." Clara was already scribbling furiously on her tablet. "We can create a natural lighting system using solar tubes, maintain the temperature naturally. It would be a one-of-a-kind project in the country." The group continued their exploration. Richard noticed something interesting about the dynamics between the people. Mark, once so arrogant and aggressive, now worked side by side with the archaeologists, fascinated by the history they were uncovering. Beatrice Andrews was enthusiastically discussing with Clara how to integrate historical elements into the modern project. Helen was already planning how to use the tunnels for local history lessons with her students. "It's amazing how a place can bring such different people together," Richard commented to Dr. Santos as they watched the group work. "You know what's most interesting?" the archaeologist replied. "These tunnels were built to connect people and businesses. A century later, they're still serving that purpose, just in a completely new way." By the end of the day, when everyone had left, Richard stayed behind, for a while, alone in the room with the old photographs. He looked at the image of the old flower shop, thinking about how fate had conspired to bring him there. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Clara with the first draft of the tunnel project. The images showed a harmonious blend of old and new, art galleries in the old storage rooms, a cultural cafe in the merchants' meeting point, and at the heart of it all, an underground garden honoring the neighborhood's florist tradition. As he climbed the stairs back to the surface, Richard smiled, thinking about how much his life had changed in recent weeks. From a simple florist trying to hide his past, he had become part of something much bigger, the renewal not just of a neighborhood, but of an entire community. Back at the flower shop, the last light of the day filtered through the windows, making the flowers glow with intense colors. Richard picked up a pot of orchids, the same species that had been cultivated in the tunnels a century ago. Some traditions, he thought, deserved to be preserved and renewed, just like flowers that need to be replanted to keep blooming. The revitalization project of Flower Village was progressing rapidly when the first serious obstacle arose. One seemingly ordinary morning, Richard received an unexpected visitor at his flower shop, Aurora Mendonça, a 75-year-old woman elegantly dressed and carrying an old leather briefcase. "So you're the one responsible for all this commotion in the neighborhood," she said, observing Richard with sharp eyes behind her gold-rimmed glasses. "I need to talk to you about these tunnels you've been discovering." Richard offered the woman a chair and prepared a cup of chamomile tea, sensing from her posture that this wouldn't be a simple conversation. "You see, young man," Aurora began, pulling out yellow documents from her briefcase, "those tunnels have a history that goes far beyond commerce. My grandfather, Giuseppe Mendonça, was one of the original founders of this neighborhood, and I have here documents that prove part of those structures belongs to my family." Richard examined the papers carefully. They were deeds and old documents, some dating back to the early 20th century, that indeed seemed to prove Aurora's claim. "And why are you bringing this up now?" Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because," Aurora smiled softly, "that underground garden you're planning? It would be right in the part that belongs to my family, and I have other plans for that space." Helen, who had arrived during the conversation, exchanged a worried look with her brother. The entire revitalization project depended on integrating the tunnels. It was the element that made the proposal unique and attractive to investors. "What kind of plans, Mrs. Aurora?" Richard asked, keeping his voice calm and interested. "My grandson Daniel is a chef," she explained. "We've always dreamed of opening a restaurant that honors our family's Italian roots. That space would be perfect for a traditional cantina." Richard poured more tea, his mind working quickly. "Have you considered how a restaurant could integrate into the current project?" Aurora tilted her head, curious. "Go on." Over the next few hours, Richard, Helen, and Aurora discussed possibilities. Clara was called in urgently and brought her plans. Soon, the small flower shop was filled with people contributing ideas. "Look, Mrs. Aurora," Clara explained, showing modified blueprints on her tablet. "We could create a unique concept, an Italian restaurant surrounded by a historical underground garden. The herbs and spices used in the kitchen could be grown right there as part of the experience." Aurora's eyes sparkled with interest. Daniel, her grandson, was called in to join the discussion and was thrilled with the possibilities. "Just imagine," he said excitedly, "we could have tables among the herb gardens, tell the story of Italian immigration through food and agriculture. It would be so much more than just a restaurant." Mark, who had arrived for his daily meeting about the youth apprenticeship program, added his own suggestion. "We could include a culinary training program for neighborhood youth, combining it with the educational project we're already developing." Aurora watched everything with an increasingly broad smile. "You know," she said finally, "when I came here today I was prepared for a legal battle, but you have an interesting way of turning problems into opportunities." Richard smiled, remembering how his own life had changed through unexpected transformations. "Sometimes, Mrs. Aurora, the best gardens grow when different seeds are mixed together." When everyone had left, Richard stayed alone in the flower shop, watering his plants and reflecting on the day's events. What had started as a potential crisis had turned into an opportunity to make the project even more special. Helen returned, later, bringing the last documents Aurora had promised to send. "Impressive how you turned an adversary into an ally," she commented. Richard smiled, adjusting a pot of chrysanthemums. "I didn't transform anyone, Helen. I just helped Mrs. Aurora see that her dreams could integrate with ours. Sometimes, the secret isn't winning a battle, but preventing it from happening." With the integration of the new tunnels and basements discovered by Aurora, the Flower Village project had transformed into something much larger than anyone could have initially imagined. The careful excavations revealed more and more about the neighborhood's history, and each discovery brought new possibilities. One particularly busy afternoon, Richard was organizing a temporary exhibition of old neighborhood photos in the Bay Flower Shop, provided by Aurora and other traditional families who had become involved in the project. The space, which already served as an informal meeting point for the community, was naturally evolving into a small cultural center. "Richard, you need to see this." Clara burst through the door carrying her tablet and several old architectural blueprints. Her eyes sparkled with that intensity that always signaled an important discovery. "What did you find this time?" Richard asked, finishing adjusting a frame showing Flower Village in 1922. "Remember that strange wall we found in the main tunnel? The one that seemed newer than the others?" Clara began spreading documents on the counter. "Well, I cross-referenced the old blueprints Aurora gave us with City Hall records and found something incredible." Helen, who was helping with the exhibition, approached curiously. Mark, who had just arrived for his daily meeting, also joined the group. "There's an entire chamber behind that wall," Clara continued, showing the blueprint overlays on her tablet, and according to these documents, it was a space dedicated to a very special project. Richard examined the documents carefully. They were records of an initiative developed by immigrants in the 1920s, an underground botanical research center where they developed cultivation techniques adapted to the local climate. "That explains the ventilation systems we found," Helen exclaimed. "They weren't just for air circulation. They were part of a climate control system for the plants." Aurora, who had become a constant presence in the project, entered the flower shop at that moment. Upon hearing about the discovery, her face lit up with recognition. "Ah, so you found my grandfather's secret garden," she smiled, sitting in her usual chair. "Giuseppe always talked about it, but we thought they were just family stories." In the following minutes, Aurora shared memories passed down from her grandfather. The Botanical Research Center had been a collaborative project between Italian, Japanese, and Brazilian immigrants, each contributing their traditional knowledge about plant cultivation. "It was a place where different cultures met through their love of plants," Aurora explained. "My grandfather said they developed many cultivation techniques there that later spread throughout the region." "Does this chamber still exist?" asked Mark, now genuinely interested in history for the first time in his life. "There's only one. Way to find out," Richard replied, already grabbing his phone to contact the archaeology team. Hours later, a small group gathered in front of the wall in question. Dr. Santos, the lead archaeologist, carefully coordinated the opening process. Beatrice Andrews, who insisted on being present for every new discovery, recorded everything on her phone. When the passage was finally opened, the flashlight beams revealed a surprising sight. The chamber was extraordinarily well preserved. Wooden shelves still held rows of glass jars with seeds. On the walls, detailed drawings showed various cultivation techniques. An elaborate system of channels and reservoirs suggested a sophisticated irrigation method. "It's incredible," Dr. Santos exclaimed, carefully examining the preserved records. "These documents show experiments with hydroponics that were very advanced for the time." Daniel, Aurora's chef grandson, who was also present, picked up one of the old record books. "Look at this. They developed techniques for growing Mediterranean herbs in tropical climates. That's revolutionary even today." As everyone explored the chamber, Richard noticed something familiar in a corner. A small ceramic pot with the same decorative pattern he had found in his flower shop when he bought it. "Mrs. Aurora," he called, showing her the pot. "Does this mean?" "Yes," she smiled, emotional. Your flower shop was the distribution point for the seedlings and seeds developed here. The previous owner, Giovanni Rossi, was my grandfather's main collaborator. The discovery hit Richard like a wave of understanding. His instinct in choosing that place to restart his life hadn't been just a coincidence. Somehow, he had been drawn to a location that had always been dedicated to transformation and new beginnings. Clara was already scribbling furiously on her tablet. This changes everything. We can integrate this space into the restaurant and underground garden project, create a modern botanical research center, honoring the work of these pioneers. And more, Helen added, her eyes shining with educational possibilities. We can develop programs that connect young people with these traditions, combine modern technology with ancestral knowledge. Mark, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. It's like the neighborhood is showing us its true purpose. So it's not just about preserving the past or building something new, it's about connecting the two. Beatrice Andrews, who had been observing everything with her astute businesswoman's eye, smiled. You know what's most interesting? This kind of discovery will attract much more investment and interest than a simple commercial project. Sometimes the true value lies in the roots. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, it was night. Back at the flower shop, Richard found an envelope someone had left on the counter. Inside was an old sepia photo showing a group of men and women of different backgrounds, all smiling in front of a greenhouse. Aurora, looking over, his shoulder pointed to one of the men in the photo. This was Giovanni Rossi, the previous owner of your flower shop. And see that greenhouse? It's exactly where we are now. Richard looked around his shop at the flowers he cultivated with such care and felt a deep connection to those pioneers who, decades before, had used that same space to create something new and meaningful. You know, Richard, Aurora said softly, my grandfather always said that plants are like people. They need strong roots to grow, but they also need space to adapt and flourish in new ways. That night, as he closed the shop, Richard realized he had found much more than a place to hide from his past. He had found a place where past and future met, where different stories intertwined like vines in a well-tended garden. 6 months had passed since the discovery of the old Botanical Research Center, and Flower Village had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. What had started as a simple revitalization project had blossomed into something much more significant. It was Saturday morning, and Richard was putting the finishing touches on the flower shop's decorations. Today was the official inauguration of the Flower Village Cultural Complex, and his shop, now expanded and renovated, would be the starting point for visitors. Everything's perfect, little brother, Helen said, entering the shop with a bouquet of flowers picked from the new underground garden. Who would have thought that intimidating visit from the bikers would bring us here? Richard smiled, remembering how it all began. The flowers in the window reflected the morning sunlight, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to dance on the walls. The doorbell chimed and Mark entered, wearing a well-tailored suit, a far cry from the rebellious young man in a leather jacket he had once been. Mr. Richard, the first visitors, are already arriving, he announced, now the official coordinator of the complex's educational program, and Mrs. Aurora is asking for your presence at the restaurant for a final check. The Cantina delle Radici, Aurora and Daniel's restaurant, had become the beating heart of the project. Located in the restored tunnels, it blended traditional Italian cuisine with herbs and vegetables grown on site, using techniques developed in the old research center. Richard descended the elegantly restored stairs leading to the tunnels. What was once dark and abandoned now glowed with life. Hanging gardens decorated the walls, illuminated by an ingenious system of solar tubes. The scent of fresh herbs mingled with the fragrance of flowers. "Ah, finally!" Aurora exclaimed, coming to meet him. "We need your approval for the vertical garden at the entrance. Daniel insists we should use more basil, but I believe edible. Flowers would give it a more special touch." As they discussed the garden's composition, Beatrice Andrews arrived, accompanied by a group of international business people. "As you can see," she was explaining, "this project has become a model of sustainable urban revitalization. The integration of commerce, culture, and historical preservation has created something unique." The investors seemed impressed, especially with the restored Botanical Research Center, which now functioned as a living laboratory where ancient and modern techniques met. Clara, who was overseeing the final adjustments to the project, approached with her ever-present tablet. "Richard, I need to show you something before the inauguration." She led him to a new area that had been kept secret until then. It was a circular room, its walls covered with photographs telling the neighborhood's history. In the center, a glass structure protected the original ceramic pot found in the tunnels. "This is our gift to you," Clara explained, "a memorial to all those who made this place what it is today, including you." Richard was speechless for a moment, moved to see how his own story was now intertwined with the neighborhood's. In the photographs, faces from the past and present mingled, the pioneer immigrants, the current shopkeepers, his team, his family. The day progressed, the complex filled with visitors. Groups of students were guided by Mark and his team of young apprentices through the historic tunnels. At the restaurant, Daniel presented dishes that told stories from 3 continents. At the flower shop, now transformed into a visitor center, Richard welcomed people from all over the city. "Look at this," Helen commented, watching the activity. "Who would have thought a former special agent would find his true purpose among flowers and old stories?" Richard smiled, adjusting a pot of orchids. "Sometimes, Helen, fate takes us on strange paths to bring us exactly where we need to be." At the end of the day, when the last visitors had left, the community gathered for a private celebration in the underground gardens. Aurora brought a special wine her family had been saving for generations. Mark and his former companions, now all involved in different aspects of the project, served appetizers prepared by Daniel. Beatrice Andrews raised her glass for a toast. "Flower Village has taught us that sometimes we need to look to the past to build a better future, and that the greatest transformations happen when different people come together for a common goal." Richard looked at the group gathered there. Aurora, the guardian of the neighborhood's memories. Mark, the young man who had found his path. Clara, with her transformative vision. Helen, his anchor through it all. Beatrice, who had learned that business could be done differently. Each of them had changed and grown throughout this journey. "You." "No," he said, raising his own glass. "There's an old tradition among gardeners. They say a flower never grows alone. It needs fertile soil, other plants around it, care and attention. This place is proof of that. It's not just a revitalization project. It's a garden where we've all grown together." That night, as the lights of the new complex glowed softly, Richard returned to his flower shop one last time. On the windowsill, a small pot of violets, the same ones Giovanni Rossi had cultivated decades ago, bloomed silently. Richard smiled, thinking about how much his life had changed. The man who once lived in the shadows was now part of something bright and alive. His past, instead of a burden to be hidden, had become a tool to build something meaningful. Flower Village had transformed, and so had everyone who was part of it. And there, among flowers and memories, old stories and new beginnings, Richard had finally found not just a refuge, but a true home. Life, he thought, closing the flower shop's door, like a garden, is always ready for a new bloom. Dear listeners, we hope Richard's story and the tale of Flower Village have touched your hearts. To continue this journey of transformation and discovery, we've prepared a special playlist of equally captivating stories. You can find it by clicking to the left of the video. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Every day, we bring new narratives that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Share in the comments which city you're watching from and which stories you'd like to hear in our next videos. Until next time.